So, one of the biggest desperate cheap shot sequel fans try to make, and excuse the lack of a proper plan for the sequel trilogy, make the excuse that the original trilogy didn't have a plan either. A claim born from complete ignorance and zero research done. And also a lack of the ability to think critically about context. So first, let's assume you're correct and that the original trilogy didn't have a plan either. It's a false equivalence. It's quite evident in 1977, Star Wars was a new IP, and the term franchise didn't exist. I actually had a discussion about this with my film teacher in high school. He told me that the term franchise was mostly used for McDonald's and KFC and shit. And the reason everyone was excited to see Star Wars, even though nobody had ever heard of George Lucas beyond THX 1138 and American Graffiti, was because film culture was much less rigid. People were excited for films, even if there were new IPs, just because they were new films. I really wish we had that mentality today. I wonder what we're missing out on, honestly. You see, unlike the sequels, the original trilogy had to build the fucking groundwork. And you don't just make a film to create a franchise, because otherwise it'll fail 99 times out of 100. You make the movie, and then the franchise will come naturally. The original Star Wars was made with the mentality of being a standalone film. Because when you're making a new IP, that's the mentality you should have. And also relying on a trilogy would be a bad idea given they didn't even know Star Wars would be a success. This is completely unlike the sequel trilogy, which was always planned to be a trilogy, but the story of the trilogy didn't have a damn plan. So yeah, it's not comparable because of the context. Second, you are fucking incorrect. I don't know where the idea that the original trilogy didn't have a plan come from, but it's absolutely not true in the slightest. The original trilogy did have a plan. In the documentary Empire at Dreams, a massive eye-opener to anyone with the rigid mindset that George Lucas is a talentless hack, around the 15-minute mark, George Lucas and the documentary discuss how in his original treatments for Star Wars, he had written so much that it couldn't be fit into one movie. So he had a trilogy planned out that he didn't know he was going to make, and George says in the documentary that he went in with the mentality that the film was going to be a complete disaster, because you shouldn't go in thinking that it's going to make billions and you're going to make 50 sequels and whatnot. Gee, it's almost like foreshadowing. Can't put my finger on what exactly. So this blatant lie doesn't even hold up to the most basic of research on the original trilogy. So what was the original trilogy plan? Well, the thing is, as I stated before, the original Star Wars was designed as a standalone film, so George wasn't banking on the hope that there would be a sequel. All he needed to do was get the one and only movie completed. You see, the original Star Wars was plagued with a limited budget and corporate interference. Looking at the J.W. Rinsler books, the original trilogy plan wasn't like a plan in the traditional sense. Rather, plot points meant for the original Star Wars changed and would later appear in the sequels. I need to emphasize here that the original trilogy were the bedrock of Star Wars, and they needed to do the groundwork. Examples of ideas that showed up in the sequels to A New Hope was a floating city that became Cloud City on Bespin, Han Solo eventually sort of coming to be a brother figure for Luke, and a Death Star at the very end, etc. When Star Wars became a success, a sequel was green-lit, and George Lucas went to work on The Empire Strikes Back. Looking at the production of the film, it was a disaster, with an awful rough cut. Again, it would be unclear whether or not the film would succeed. George had to take out a loan to keep the movie going, and looking at the production like that, the third movie would be the least of his concern, although it was a small factor. And the thing is, unlike The Last Jedi, The Empire Strikes Back ended on a clear path for the heroes to go on. We know that in the third movie, Luke would have to confront Vader, Han Solo would have to be freed from Jabba the Hutt, and the Empire would need to be defeated. A clear path for the sequel. When we look at how The Last Jedi ended, it was an absolute dumpster fire. Snoke was dead and Kylo Ren became the main villain presumably, which of course doesn't work because he isn't powerful enough to be a main villain, and the Resistance was down to a handful, which is going to take a hell of a story to get them to regroup. So what does JJ do? Well, he just skips over a lot of necessary events, brings Palpatine back with no prior build-up, changes Rey's lineage, refills the Resistance without sufficient explanation. It's like The Rise of Skywalker skipped a movie. Rise of Skywalker co-writer Chris Terrio apparently said that the movie probably should have been split into 2 parts. And yeah, he's right. That probably would have made The Rise of Skywalker infinitely better with all the shit it tried to cram into one movie with no prior setup. Like, the sequel trilogy still would have failed, but at least it would have felt more like a coherent narrative. We also need to keep in mind that there were conflicting ideas between George Lucas and Lawrence Kasdan when it came to Return of the Jedi. I've discussed this in a previous video, but to sum it up, Lawrence Kasdan had a lot of shitty ideas, such as having Luke use the Death Star to destroy the Imperial capital and kill countless people, making a spin-off trilogy where Luke finds his long-lost sister, and having Luke become the president of the galaxy. You're never going to find this level of nuance from a sequel fan, because Disney censors the behind-the-scenes production of their projects and spews false claims about George Lucas's. But nonetheless, here's how both the original trilogy did have a plan, albeit a non-traditional one, and how comparing the original trilogy without a plan to the sequels is a false equivalence. And that's the incorrect, cheap, ignorant, and lazy excuse sequel fans make, where they actively lie, either intentionally or unintentionally, but it's their fault regardless for not doing any research. The original Star Wars was designed to be a standalone film, did have a plan, and George used other stuff from his original treatments for the sequels, but given he was still building the groundwork, things would obviously change. Context, context, context. So whenever you see a meme like this on Twitter or in the YouTube comment section, just link them my video and they'll either block you or persist with their false claims. So to wrap this video up, here are my patrons on screen. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?